Hello, everyone. It's Martha Novak. I've been out of commission for about 2 weeks working on my book, my next book. So I am so glad to be back with you today. I realize I haven't written a description on Facebook Live, but I only just realized that 5 seconds before I was supposed to go on the air, so I apologize about that, guys. I am here today. We are being broadcast over Blog Talk Radio and Facebook Live. All of our shows are archived, by the way, on both of those channels and on YouTube. So please tune in to anything. We have a variety of subjects, all that deal with consciousness. I hope you all are well. Haven't talked to my team in a long time, so let me know how you are. I hope everything is well. We're going to talk about really quite an interesting subject today, which is birth order. I taught birth order from a book that I'll tell you about in a few minutes, several years ago. And I certainly think it is or can be part of the personality. I think we ought to talk about it, since we talk about a lot of things relative to personality here. The other thing that I want to put on the table, though, is even the negative traits that have to do with our birth order, anything else, we should confront. We should be working on consciousness. That's the whole reason you're listening to a show like this. Hi, darling. Nothing is a doomsday pronouncement. You're going to see the fascinating way that birth order has even come about. And one of the things that I think is very powerful to talk about is not the birth order itself, but how it's formed. Because how it's formed is how most everything is formed. In a conscious or unconscious way, you're picking up what your parents believe. What your parents believe are these poles. Here's your mother, here's your father, or like substitutes, right, that are influencing you. And until we reach a certain level of emotional maturity in ourselves, we ping from one to the other. Let's say we don't like our mothers and we embrace our fathers. So anything that reminds us in life of our mothers, we avoid or we strike against, we move away from, we resist, and we embrace this other pole. The fact is, you're not either one of these poles, you see. You're your own being. And so what we're trying to do is free you up to be your authentic self. These things have influences, positive or negative, that we must transcend, and to be your own person and find out who you authentically are. And that's what we're doing here when we talk about a subject like this in a nutshell. Let's do a quick prayer, get us all on the same page, and then we will launch off. Hello, everyone who's tuning in. We're awfully glad to see you. And you can certainly write me on Facebook Live. Thank you. That's how you can communicate with me. Those of you that are listening on the radio, through Blog Talk Radio on your computers. If you hear me acknowledging people, they are speaking to me through writing on Facebook Live. And you can also call me if you want to talk to me directly. The guest call-in number is 347-850-1647. We laugh if you've been listening to this show for any length of time. We never know which technology is going to last and to stay up. So I say you can call me, but I don't know whether you can or not. I hope you would be able to. If not, get on Facebook Live. Real Talk with Martha Novak. I forgot to introduce myself, didn't I? Hello, I'm Martha Novak. Real Talk with Martha Novak. And you certainly can write me through the show. There's always easy access through my website as well, www.marthanovak.com. Under radio shows. Those buttons should help you tune right in. Thank you, sweetie. Let's do a prayer. Dear God, thank you so much for the opportunity of all of us being together again under the banner of loving you and opening ourselves to knowing more of the you that truly is us all the way. We ask now to be open and to bring that higher self to this experience today as we stand in unity, in consciousness, in interest, in consciousness under the banner of loving you. Hello, Sheila. We thank you so much for all of this, dear God, and we open to knowing nothing, for it is the you through us and through all things that know it all. We listen to that today, and thank you so much for the opportunity of coming together and talking. Thank you, and so it is. Amen. Oh, aren't you sweet? Oh, Alexandra, thank you. I'm Martha from now on. Alexandra is just writing me, and my darling, I won't say your name on the radio, but I will say that that's the prettiest name I ever heard. Oh, aren't you sweet? Well, I'm so glad that you're here. We're here most every Sunday morning. I say that having missed the last 2 Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock, but I am trying to complete my last book, my most recent book. I should not say my last book. My Lord, that sounds like I'm going to kick off, and I'm not. So, so anyway, and Keisha, oh, I'm so glad to see you, darling. Well, I'm glad that all of you all are here. Great. This thrills me. So, years ago, I found a marvelous book, and I do recommend this. I think it's rather an older book, but still just a marvelous book, and this is the one at one point I taught out of. It's called The Birth Order Book. It's by Dr. Kevin Leman, or Lemon. I guess it's Lemon. And it's not spelled like the fruit. It's Lemon. If you're going to get this after you hear this lecture, then by all means do. Oddly enough, this article I found, and the article is, the title is What Birth Order Reveals About Your Personality Traits, Even If You're an Only Child. It actually made me think of the Lemon book, and but she takes her information. This was written by Maren Liles, Liles, if you want to check it out on the internet. As usual, I'll put my 2 cents worth in here and there. But I think this is certainly a valid thing. Is this the only personality thing? No. Guys, you've got to understand that our personalities are complex. They come from so many things. Our genetics, they come from the immediate family and the distant one. They come from our experiences in life. They come from, honestly, what our soul needs to learn and needs to see and needs to experience, so that we can be more intelligent and better as the aspect of God we are. And you keep in mind that, at least in my point of view, our lives are not just this earthly life that we call our lives, that begin with our birth and end with our death. I believe that we are a continuum. I think we go on far after our physical death, and that everything is a learning experience, and everything is the amplification of the aspect of God we are. So do keep that in mind as you listen to, hello, Sheila. You're an only child? Well, you know what? So am I. We were both only children, so we will talk about that as well. We're going to talk about everything, quite frankly, about this subject, and I think this is a very good article to start with. Hints. So, by all means, get Dr. Lemon's book, and there's also another book I want to recommend. Now, I have not read this one. I just have read Dr. Lemon's book, but this article was taken from this book. It's Dr. Catherine Salmon, 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 like the fish. The Secret Power of Middle Children is the name of her book. There's some other psychologists that are quoted in here, so there we are. I'll be referring to them. Now, do know, like Sheila, where you fall into place in the lineup of your family. I think that's going to be a really important thing, because these next 90 minutes are all about you. It is all about you and what you've done with your birth order. We're going to talk first, because I think this is so important, and this was why I was impressed with this article. What's so important is realizing how these things were formed in the first place, right? Because if you realize how these things are formed in the first place, you realize they're not set in stone. Even all our positive and negative aspects are not set in stone. We can change them. You see, all of our issues, no matter what they are, whether they come from birth order or something else, are sorry about the dog. We're out here in the mountains. And as you can probably tell from all the wood around me. And we have all sorts of animals that come on our porch and eat the birdseed, right? As a matter of fact, we've gotten some really great pictures of raccoons and possums and, of course, squirrels. And that's probably what Toffel is reacting to right now, my little poodle. Nevertheless, we must push on, so try to compartmentalize his voice, if you will. I think it's really fascinating when we think about how our issues are formed. And of course, if you're in private session with me, we're talking about how the issues are formed based on the information you got from your family. And it's not as easy as that either, because what happens is, in our psychology, we're telling ourselves all sorts of things. For example, we are, with our issues, normalizing them, saying, well, every family experiences a father who beats them, for example. Or we are generalizing, oh, all men are mean because my father was mean and irrational. Or we are elevating issues to the height of something that is holy. Oh, God wants me to sacrifice like this. God wants me to turn the other cheek and never face my real feelings, for example. We have a lot of devices like that one, or like making good things bad, good things that, for example, like personal growth, bad. Oh, it'll hurt. We don't want to open that can of worms. We do just fine without opening that can of worms. Or we make good things or bad things good. I need to keep my fantasy going because it helps me put one foot in front of the other, and one day my prince may come, for example. Okay? The fact is, we are complicated. We are very complex and complicated beings. The advantage of a radio show is that I can talk about a variety of subjects relative to consciousness, but I don't have to go into your particular psychology except in private session, right? So nothing will embarrass you here, but we very much need to talk about a variety of things that all contribute to who you are. The main thing I want you to remember, though, is everything's changeable. Everything is changeable. These were states of mind, how you decided to be for one reason and one reason only when you were a kid, and that was to survive. You had to survive. You see, before you're 7 years old, and then that's the going rate, used to be 8, now it's 7. By the time you get to 7 years old, you're cooked like a fine Christmas goose psychologically. You know how you're going to be. You know the way the world is. You have formed opinions about yourself and your God and your family and all the people in it and the people outside and animals and anything else in the world, you see. Can those things be changed? Absolutely, they can. You know why? Because it's energy. It's all movable energy. But while great psychology can help you, and that's a marvelous thing, and it does relieve you to know how all of this works, what really relieves you is when someone will go to the very bottom line, and you have to go through a lot of this before you can get to the bottom line, before your ego child's mind, which develops around 18 months old when your ego does, has put it all together, you see? And that really does free you completely from some of this, from whatever you're working on. I wanted to put that on the table because from my point of view, that's really the way it is. I can't take a new person that I'm just beginning to work with and teach them what I am teaching my students that have worked with me for 20 years. There's no way. They can't handle it. It sound like what? Who was that? Jack Nicholson? You can't handle the truth. No, that's simply not true. You've got to understand, however, that too little, too soon, or too late is not good, and too much, too little, or too late is not good. We have to be willing to grow at our natural pace, and that's what we try to observe. So, all that said, let's go on. So, now you know where you are in the lineup. Yay! This Marin Lyles goes on to say, they do believe that birth order, and I do think this is true, influences your overall personality. However, I'm going to say it's not the only thing that influences your overall personality, but this is a piece of it. So let's go on and pick up this piece, right? Being the oldest child, the middle child, or the youngest child, or the child that doesn't have any siblings at all, have certain personality traits that go with them. And that's what we'll talk about today. For instance, the oldest child is usually more mature. And the youngest is known, what, to be able to get away with everything. There we are. So, psychologists do say that this absolutely has an influence on the personality. So we're going to talk about why. Now, birth order is the order in which a person is born compared to their siblings. Okay? If you're the firstborn child, we just need to put this on the table so all of us are in the same sphere of understanding. If you're the firstborn child, your birth order would be referred to as the oldest child. So when I say that, that's what it means. If you're the secondborn, you're a middle child. However, there can be multiple middle children, right? So, but they're all still middle children. All right. If you're the last sibling born, you are the youngest child or the baby of the bunch. And if you have no siblings at all, you're like me and like Sheila. We are only children. Now, let's talk about how this affects personality, how it all forms. Certainly, your personality is shaped by a variety of factors. I mentioned your genetics, certainly your environment, and it's certainly influenced, and it matters here, by the way your parents treat their children. The parents tend to treat children differently based on their birth position. By the way, and a slew of other factors like age and responsibility and accountability and many, many other things. But some personality traits become more common because of how they were reared in oldest, middle, and youngest children. As a result of this, hello, Lisa. Good to see you, sweetheart. I'm so glad that you're with us today. This concept of how sibling birth order affects personality was first introduced by a psychologist named Frank Sulloway. Sulloway's niche differentiation theory, I don't think I've had enough tea to say that word, of birth order effects, suggests, and I quote, that successive children are most different from sibling preceding them in an attempt to be unique, obtain attention and resources. Well, that's true. From this perspective, personality is a strategy that shapes how you interact with the world around you. Now, that is Dr. Catherine Salmon commenting on his theory. Again, Catherine Salmon, I think this article was mostly taken from her work, wrote a book called The Secret Power of Middle Children. Birth order differences are thus shaped by differences in parental investment and the effects of sibling competition. We're going to go into a lot more detail. Hang on. There is a marriage and family counselor named Sarah Schmelzer. I love that name, by the way. And she says an easy way to understand this is to look at relationships among family members. For example, and this is her quote, she says, new parents bring home their firstborn from the hospital and they have a desire to do everything right. So they're going to sanitize the pacifier every time it falls on the floor, and they're going to attend to each whimper the child makes in the crib. The parents' level of anxiety and internal expectations of themselves, by the way, is communicated and reinforced through repeated behaviors and interactions with the child over time. As the parents become more comfortable attending to the needs of the child, their anxiety decreases. And their expectations become more in sync with reality, right? And what's actually possible. And all that makes sense, doesn't it? It certainly does. Here, but things get trickier when another sibling is introduced. Building on the above example, Schmelzer goes on to say, when the middle child arrives, parents may not sanitize the pacifier every time it falls on the floor. They'll say, oh, a little dirt won't hurt anybody, right? They'll let the child whimper a little bit more in the crib and learn how to self-soothe. They're not going to jump at everything like they did the first child. Essentially, now that parents have done the drill the first time around, it's kind of common for them to be slightly lax about the next child, right? When it's 3 or more siblings, a new twist is added to the mix. Schmelzer goes on to say, as the parents adjust to having 2, then comes the youngest child. The older children are now part of attending to the needs of the youngest for play and attention and entertainment. And since there is a combination of nature and nurture involved in the development of an individual's personality, these subtle environmental differences can play a role in how the individual's personality evolves. So let's talk about some traits. I think that's what we all want to know. Hang on. Firstborn children can be goal-oriented, outspoken, stubborn, independent, and perfectionists. Schmelzer goes on to say, when you look at the way firstborns are nurtured, it starts to make sense why, don't you think? These traits are often reinforced by parents through their interactions with the child. Firstborn children are unique from other children because their parents are new to the job. They're learning how to do everything as they go. They're worried about everything, by the way, too, and whether they're doing it right. Therefore, they tend to be more strict. They have higher expectations of themselves and possibly the child, and they're more anxious with their oldest than they would be other children. that they may have down the road. As other siblings are added to the mix, the oldest child tends to take on a bit of a second parent role, usually to their younger sister or brother. Firstborns tend to score high on conscientiousness due to their surrogate parent role in the family and the responsibilities that go with that. They end up helping out with things like feeding the children bottles, playing with them, and will even feel protective over them, which makes them somehow someone that their siblings look up to, all right? You know, I've been watching birth order for a long time in my work, and this is really true. I have also seen oldest children very resentful of their role. They feel like, from what we're talking about right now, that they were somehow, they didn't get enough. They didn't get what everybody else got. The interesting thing is I'm thinking of a client particularly, and certainly she did get everything physically that she could possibly have gotten. But this, she deals with being scarred because she was put into the adult role and she didn't get all the attention and all the playing and all the creativity and all the interaction with her parents that she wanted. I think that's fascinating because as the adult grows up without without interruption from us, an adult grows up to feel deprived, like they were not getting as much as everybody else. They never define what they didn't get. They may say, well, I didn't get a car when I was in high school. Okay, well, all right. They got something else, though, like payment for their new house. But because they cannot get over the fact of birth order, there's a resentment there whose language they can express. Isn't that interesting? They also score, now we're still talking about the oldest, they also score high on the aspect of extroversion known as dominance. Now that's a real important word here, dominance, which is where the strong leader's stereotype comes from. It makes sense. Salmon, this is Salmon who says this. One can see how these traits would make for people inclined to be leaders in various settings. Their privileged status as first child and the fact that it's in their best interest to continue to curry parental favor also plays a role in how the personality evolves. I think that's really interesting. I think it's great to be a strong leader. I don't think it's so great to be dominant. It's the difference in how we look at things. If you are studying consciousness, all of a sudden words have a real important meaning for you. I think 2 weeks ago when I was lecturing here, I believe I told you the story of when Michael and I give parties, and I've been giving parties my whole life. Not only have I been giving parties, I've been giving small parties and great big parties. I know I'm a good party giver. And when in the first year we were married, because I know what needs to be done, I'm, giving orders and saying this needs to be done. Would you do this? Would you? That's what I did, right? And he got real offended because he thought I was telling him what to do. And the interesting thing was I wasn't telling him what to do. If nobody's doing anything, I'll be glad to say that needs to be done next and needs to be done next, just because I have the list in my head, right? If he came up with a better idea, I'm all for it. He can do it. That's just great. Do it. But I didn't know what he knew and what he didn't know about giving big parties like this, right? So I had to have a talk with him, and I said, look, just because I know what needs to be done and am giving you that and saying that doesn't mean that I'm trying to emasculate you in any way. That's just not true. And I think this is something very similar to that. You can be a great leader without being dominating. You better separate those out in your head, because I don't think dominance, who enjoys that? Oh, do tell. Not anybody I know. And certainly not anybody who is emotionally mature. Okay? So, just want to put that on the table. So, here's some key birth order traits of firstborn children. Ready? They're go-getters. They're responsible. They're often role models. They can be very determined. They're rule followers. It's interesting, that one. I'm going to stop with that for a second. Rule followers. Have you ever separated what's your mother's rule, father's rule, from what you think your rules are? I think that's really important to do. What are your rules? Because without knowing this and looking at this and making very clear and what? Conscious decisions. Aware and conscious decisions. And you remember the road to enlightenment is awareness, consciousness, enlightenment. We just default to our parents' rules. Well, their rules are not your rules. You may find one wonderful and helpful and carry it forward. Yeah, well, and Lisa is saying we had no rules. Yeah, there you go. You know, I didn't have many rules. My husband had lots of rules. We laugh because he accuses me of having rules when I have no rules. And he's not saying that he's the one with the rules. I didn't have too many rules either. I had some. I mean, we all have some. You know, you learn, even if you don't learn from your parents, you learn in society not to do this and not to do that. If that's not a good idea, you are not received well when you do this, you see? So it's not that we grow up without some. Yeah, you were free-range kids. Lisa, that's adorable. You were free-range kids. I know that wasn't so adorable to grow up that way, because I think it helps when parents are hands-on and do teach us the way to be in the world. It makes us feel safer, doesn't it? It's interesting because some of us now are learning that those rules were not ours, but that's the way. So just because you had rules or just because you didn't have rules doesn't mean that you can't be right where you are right now with defining who and what you're going to be from this point on. What you're going to live by and what you're going to take forward, you see? I personally don't like the word rules. I think that there is something childish and oppressive about that, don't you all? I do think there are personal policies, words to live by, and I may be just quibbling with definitions of things in my own mind now, but yeah, I very much feel that. Keep in mind, too, there are rules of good conduct, and there are rules of good relationship. Michael and I sometimes, when we have any kind of a disagreement, he'll say, that's your rule. And it's like, no, that's a rule of good hygiene. That's a rule of good relationship. That's that kind of rule. Look it up. It's not a question of my rules, you see. So there are those in the world. I'm just urging you, as somebody who teaches consciousness and enlightenment, to not default to just believing whatever, but actually think things through. Next time you find yourself doing something or feeling adamant about something, is it your mother's rule? Is it your father's rule? Is it your rule now. Why is it your rule? I'll tell you something that we were talking about this morning, and this is kind of gross to talk about, but I think it's interesting. I read an article on the internet, and it was just, I can't tell you what the article was, but it was why you should always close the cover when you flush the toilet. Sorry to be so whatever, but anyway, here we go. This is a good example. And I've never thought about that, but let me tell you, this article so grossed me out that when you flush, there's so much crap that really gets into microscopic levels, bacteria and all sorts of things come out of that, and that's the reason one should close the lid. Well, I've never known what the lid is for. I wasn't reared in a family that knew that. So I read that and I thought, well, to me that makes sense. So I have been closing the lid, and Michael doesn't close the lid, and I keep saying I got to find that article so I can show him. But that's an example of, maybe I should close the lid from now on. I'm thinking maybe that should be a new rule. And it's all right if I do it and he doesn't. I mean, I'm usually not in the bathroom at all when he's in there. But I thought, well, that's just another way to keep us healthy and safe, like, making sure we brush our teeth 2 or 3 times a day. Probably shouldn't have put those examples together in the same sentence, but anyway. Let's talk about middle children, shall we? Oh, I hadn't finished the oldest children. So rule follower, all that was about rules. Hard worker, cautious, bossy, and timely. I think that's an interesting list, don't you? Again, all these lists are going to have positive and negative connotations. Everything can be changed. Knowing you're an oldest child doesn't mean you have to be bossy. It just means you have an inclination to be bossy. So let's change that. Let's make sure that you're just a good leader. And I don't think good leaders boss people around, do you? I've known some fabulous leaders in my time. And fabulous leaders inspire other people to do well. They're not telling everybody what to do. I learned this in the theater. You all know, if you know me at all, I grew up in theater and film. And I quickly made my transition into directing theater because I was certainly more interested in the large picture. You see, an actor it's all about you relative to other people on the stage, relative to the author's words, relative to the props you carry, to the movement you make. It's a very personality-oriented thing. But directing, you get to see the whole picture. And I'm kind of one of those whole picture kind of gals. I really like that. There's nothing wrong with the other. It's just this is my inclination. And by the way, we usually have a large picture, small picture inclination. Not that we get to indulge in that. Most people have to do both in life. I know I do. Okay, that's enough said. But I could really see this in this thing about bossiness in theater, because you start out, when you read a play and you're directing people, you see the way you would like it to be in your mind, and you realize you might not get that. You shouldn't. If you do, you're completely taking away their creativity. So what you do is you say, well, what do you feel here? Or would you like to move? Instead of, okay, move here, put your hand in your pocket there. No, you don't do that. What do you feel? And you try to hire actors that know how to do that, right? That have that instinct, because then you as a director have to do very little. Okay. So you learn not to be bossy. You learn how to pull this out of someone else so that they may express themselves. Now, many times, things that would come out of someone didn't look good. And I'd try to say, this doesn't work, what you're doing. And they would insist that it did. And then rather than try to convince him, I'd say, okay, let's do this. Let me film that. And then you see it. And every single time they'd say, oh, I had no idea. You're right. That doesn't look good. And they'd change their performance. So that's the way to deal with this. And in your own relationships, in your own friendships, and whatever is going on in your business, there are ways to deal with things without dominance. Just a note. Okay. Let's talk about middle child birth order traits. Middle children tend to stand out somewhat on agreeableness and openness to experience. Now, this is Dr. Salmon. That is her quote. They're highly invested in getting on well with others. They have experience negotiating for what they need within the family and always have to share divided parental investment. From the moment the second child is born, Salmon goes on to say, they share everything with their older sibling, so they never know what it's like to have 100% of their parents' attention in the first place. This certainly can influence the development of their inherent personality traits. This is what Schmelzer says. Middle children can be diplomatic, nurturing, introspective, tentative, and have a tendency toward keeping the peace. If these traits are already inherent in the personality, being a middle child can make them develop even more and emphasize these traits even more. And then, why? Because they're reinforced through parental interaction. A second-born's family expands, and that child becomes an older sibling. Their roles in the family changes as they officially become the middle child. Sometimes this causes what's known as, and this is something I've worked with for a while, middle child syndrome. That's a thing if you want to look it up. If this occurs, if the personality goes in this direction as the middle child, it can lead them to rebel or to find a way to get people's attention, such as being funny, and being funny maybe inappropriately. So it can cause them to really get into some extreme measures. But claiming the middle child spot also has quite a few advantages. Now, you understand that our personalities are inclined to accept the negative or the positive, to go one way or another. These are decisions we make along the way. These are not even decisions we make. They are responses we make until we can mature enough to make decisions. Do I want to be this way, inappropriately funny, or do I want to channel that to really use it to make money? That's a good thought. It's the flip of a coin here. One side is one set of behaviors. The other side can be the same set of behaviors, but channeled and used and there to add value in some way, you see? Okay. Being a middle child in your sibling's birth order means you're likely more creative, since you've had to teach yourself how to combat boredom, and that you're likely super flexible and can adapt to changing situations. That's interesting about birth order. I measure very adaptable on any personality chart. Seems to be my greatest talent. I'd like to have other great talents. But, actually, as I have matured, I've realized what a good one that is, being adaptable. As an only child, I had to learn that. Okay? But here, the middle child could already be accepting that. Whoops. So someone has come to see you. Hello, this is Toffel, who has a citronella collar on, so he doesn't bark that much. We'll see whether that works or not. All right. Oh, he likes to sit behind me in my chair and perch me on the edge. So let's talk about birth order traits of middle children beyond what I've said so far. The first one is they're adaptable. Thank you. Lisa said he was cute. They're adaptable. They can be social butterflies. They know how to negotiate with kids, right? With people. Sometimes they can be dreamers, generous, creative, rebellious, competitive, funny, and great negotiators. It's interesting, I don't mean to do anything. This is just a thought that flips in my mind. Certainly I'm not equating animals to people or vice versa. But I see birth order influences animals as well. My dog, the one you've just met, Toffel, was born into a litter of 7 puppies. And at the very same time he was born, I think on that very day or 2 days before or afterwards, another litter was born of 7 puppies by another dog that this kennel had. So when I went to pick out a dog, the breeder, by the way, I have had rescues all my life, and I love rescues. But I had lost 6 animals in 2 years, and I was just over losing anybody. So I wanted to get a dog that had really strong genetics, as much as I could find. We never know anything, do we? And something that didn't have a lot of inherent genetic problems. So poodles were up there, right? So that's the reason I went there. I guess I should say that in this world where everybody has an opinion about rescue or breeding, but sometimes you just go, I've had enough at my age. I don't want to bury anything else for a while. What's interesting about this, that's wonderful, Sheila. I'm so glad you have 3 rescue dogs. My last dog was rescue. She was a wonderful dog. I lost her about 5 years ago, and I think about her every day. So it was interesting because she died of something. I'm off the subject now. She died of something called Wobbler's syndrome. She was a great big dog, right? And it had to do with how big she was. She was 85 pounds. And Michael and I simply, when she got this, could not pick her up. We couldn't help her. And so, hence, I guess I reached the age where I said, I've got to have a little dog if I can't pick them up so I can help them. I don't think I can live with myself. So anyway, hence the poodle. And he's wonderful. But what I want to say is because he came from such a big litter, one of the things that I have trouble with him about is he's very competitive. So we have some cats here in the house, and oh man, he's the monitor. He didn't like it if a cat gets too close and we're eating something. He won't let me, he really has to fuss. Now, he's not aggressive. I don't mean to imply that. I'm just telling you a story about, you will even see it with animals. My last dog, Honey, this dog that I referred to that died of Wobbler's syndrome, was like that too. So I already knew, even though she was a rescue and came from one of the rescue things at PetSmart services, I knew the kind of family she came from, and I knew what to do, and I know what to do with him. So look for that in your animals. You'll see it quite clearly. Define what they were, you know. All right. The list of middle children birth orders we said creative, we said rebellious, competitive, that's where I stopped, funny, and a great negotiator. Yeah, you can see how that would come out. Now let's talk about youngest child, okay? And then we're going to go to only child. So hang on, Sheila. Parents with multiple kids are certainly more laid back and lenient when it comes to raising their youngest child, the so-called baby of the family. This is why youngest children usually end up having a more happy-go-lucky personality. And since the youngest born's other siblings are older and have become less reliant on the parents, the baby of the family is also given a little extra attention, which can sometimes keep them from becoming super independent, like the firstborn. In general, high agreeableness, extroversion in the social dimension, and openness is associated with the youngest children. Oh, yes, that's you, Lisa. Yeah, Lisa is claiming that. Dr. Salmon goes on to say, sometimes low conscientiousness is present due to the lack of responsibilities and parental indulgence over expectations. I've known parents that will do everything. They kind of spoil this youngest child, you know. Now, I know that wasn't you, Lisa, so I'm not talking about you. But it can go into that. There's something called learned helplessness. I think that sometimes it's there, you know. I think of that young man that they accused of affluenza. I think that sometimes we can just overindulge people and enable people. And oftentimes, without a parent's knowledge, this might be the youngest child. As a result of these lack of responsibilities, youngest children can tend to excel in areas involving a social dimension. Very charming. Oh, but they may be seen or see themselves as the baby all the time, you see. Schmelzer goes on to add, youngest children can be charismatic, creative, mischievous, boisterous, and dependent on others. Traits that, if inherent in the child, are often reinforced through the family's communication and behavior. Because no matter how old the youngest child turns, they will always fill one role, and that is being the baby. That's where they're spoiled, and they can do no wrong, and that's where that stereotype comes from. So let's talk about key birth order traits in the youngest children. Sometimes they're risk takers. Sometimes they don't take risks at all. Sometimes they're outgoing. Okay, Lisa, I'm sure. Sometimes they're outgoing, dependent on other people, on parents, on whatever. Persistent, fun-loving, charming, easygoing, free-spirited, sometimes spoiled. I know a family that I work with, and I just adore them, whose son was the youngest, everybody else's girl, right? And he had a hard time finding himself. He has found himself now, let me tell you. He's a marvelous restaurateur, and he's making a huge success of it. But he's using all of these charming traits. He's charming, okay? He's charming. He can run a restaurant with the best of them, but he's out front talking to people, making everybody feel great. He's great at this. Now, what was interesting when I think back on it, because he has really, really changed, but when he had not found himself, he was a bit manipulative. He'd tell you what you want to hear and then go about doing his own thing, right? So I want you to know that people absolutely can change and mature and grow and start being who they really are in a higher sense. It's not that they have to stay manipulative forever, you understand? Are we ready to talk about only children? Let's do it. Only children do. Oh, yeah. And Lisa, that's so important. Lisa was sharing that her older sister, closest to me in age, was her parent and spoiled her rotten, still does. And while that's good, and it is good in a way, you have to make sure that there's a fine line between being incredibly loving and enabling someone in behaviors that shouldn't be supported. You understand? I'm trying to remember, and this is the second time I've tried to remember this. There was something in the work I do in somebody's session that came up this week about this very thing. And I said at the time, I remember, wait a minute, I'm almost there. It was a friend of mine whose son is ill. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but she has stepped over the line in the past, trying to help this son out of incredible love and probably out of a little guilt. And what has happened, thank you, Lisa, I appreciate that. What has happened is she is all of a sudden waked up to, wait a minute, a lot of this behavior was enabling, was placating, was people-pleasing, was trying to get him to love her. And the interesting thing is when you do that, when you enable, a lot of time, hey, Michelle, oh, I'm so glad you tuned in, all my friends. Oh, I'm so glad to see all of you. A lot of times, children turn on parents, then enable. It's as if somewhere inside them, they understand that that shouldn't have happened. And while they were the beneficiaries of that kind of indulgence, they also resent the hell out of it. So many times enabling backfires, you know? It's the biting the hand that feeds you syndrome, if you will. You get it? Okay. So going back to only children, birth order traits. They have more as an only child, generally speaking. Of course, all of this is general, isn't it, darlings? They are the sole focus of the parental investment most of the time. Dr. Salmon goes on to say that as a result, parental expectations and pressure can be high, driving them toward traits sometimes shared with firstborns, including being ambitious, I know that was true in my case, independent, bossy, and strong-willed. Strong-willed. My mom was remarkable. She was so strong-willed. God bless her. She died of spinal cancer. It was a horrible death, and I was real close to my mother, but I have a funny story about this. That's the reason I stepped away for a minute. I don't think I've told you all this. So my mother is dying in the last few weeks of her life. At one point, about 3 weeks before she died, she stopped eating. And very close to the end, of course, I'm not very close to the end, but within a couple of weeks she stopped drinking, and still she hung on. And I remember hospice, not knowing that my first husband and I were not getting along in this at this time. She turned to him and she said, "How does it feel being married to the daughter of such a strong-willed woman?" He didn't appreciate that. What a shame. But anyway, it was funny. I thought it was hilarious. Didn't say anything until now. You know all my secrets. She goes on to say, this Dr. Salmon, because only children don't have any siblings to play with and or compete with when growing up, they are sometimes less competitive. Sometimes they aren't very ambitious. Competition and ambition, by the way, aren't the same thing. I was very ambitious. I was never very competitive. If there was a competition going on, it was within me, I'm very creative. And so everything I wrote, I tried to write something better next time, learn what I did wrong. Every play I was ever in, everything I ever directed, there was no competition other than what I did in my own head with what I did the last time, Thank you, Sheila. On the flip side, Salmon goes on to say, only children can be independent and usually more mature because we're around more adults than kids when we grow up, right? So she goes on to list now birth order traits of only children. Here we are. Oh, Sheila says, how about having imaginary friends? Well, I don't know what the imaginary friend's birth order is, so we can't address that. I have a lot of clients that had imaginary friends. I didn't have any. I think imaginary friends, now this is just my own opinion, might come out of a childhood where you're not allowed to use a lot of your imagination. I know that I've got a couple of clients that had imaginary friends, and they were kind of oppressed in their childhood, and imagination was not encouraged. Creativity was not encouraged. And you had to, okay, good. Well, think of your childhoods, Now, this might help explain my theory, and it's only theory. It really is. I came from a very eccentric household. My uncle was a doctor, yes, but he was a concert pianist. And I grew up singing and dancing and acting, and by God, I had to do that at every party he ever gave, which was all the time. Yes, Sheila said, and this was after her father died, and she was 8, and she felt alone. Absolutely. Just because I'm coming up with this theory does not mean that something like that certainly can't happen, because it does. I think that if you all will also think, so anyway, I came from a very theatrical household, a very expressive household. And so I never did have an imaginary friend. I always thought that was pretty cool, but, I was encouraged to write and to act and to do all that. But I also think of the movie, what is the movie? Castaway with Tom Hanks. Do you all remember that movie? And here he was alone on this island, and there was no help. And he had to get himself off the island or die. He came to that conclusion. But to grow as a human being, he had to have Wilson the volleyball. You remember Wilson the volleyball? It was, he had accidentally cut his hand, and when he picked up the volleyball, it made a face. So he started talking to Wilson the volleyball. The reason I'm telling you this story is, Sheila, I think this might have a lot to do with what you're doing, or you said you did. So what happened was Wilson the volleyball, he would have discussions with, and he would hear the volleyball answer, in his own mind. He never wasn't crazy. He just needed that interaction. And if you will recall, Wilson the volleyball gave him permission to be more than he was when he didn't think he had it inside of him. Now, here's the big deal. And why I thought that movie was so beautifully done, acted, directed, written, is because at one point when he finally has the courage to either die or get off the island, you'll recall that he built a raft, and Wilson the volleyball is on the raft, and he's asleep, Tom Hanks, not Wilson, and Wilson drops off and floats away. It was interesting because when that happened, I looked around the theater before COVID, and everybody was crying. And you know what? I think they were crying because whether you say it in words or not, these times come in our lives where we can't have someone else confirming what we need to do. It needs to start coming from inside us. And when Tom Hanks made that decision, and it really was coming from inside him, and he was putting his life on the line for it, the outer representation, outer voice, had to leave. I think this is why sometimes children grow out of having imaginary friends. But for all those reasons, I think one can have an imaginary friend. And that's wonderful. But that's why they leave as well. Key birth order traits of only children: mature, loyal, independent, confident, leader, cautious, curious, and sensitive. I think that's a pretty good list. Well, how do you think that fits you, Sheila, as the only child? I would say it probably fits you pretty well. Now, guys, what I want to put as a last thought for you about this is whatever your birth order and your personality traits, you should make the most of the positive ones, for sure. And you have the opportunity, doing energy work, to work on the less than positive ones. And in certain cases, to simply shift the personality trait from the egoic child's mind to the higher self. In other words, yeah, Sheila, absolutely. Darling, if you weren't sensitive, you wouldn't be interested in this work, you know? So I knew that about you, absolutely, you know, for sure. And Lisa says, indeed. Thank you, sweethearts. I love you. I think it's so important, guys, for you to now really see what words mean, because words carry different energy. Are you bossy? Are you dominant? Or are you strong and a good leader? Those are all different energies. Do you understand that? Thank you, Sheila. You are so dear. Do you all understand that? Listen, you know, are you bossy? Are you dominant? Are you a good leader? Or are you strong? Well, look at those 4 words. Those 4 words have completely different meanings. And yet, do understand. I go back to the threshold exercise that I've had you all do in the past. For those of you that are new, draw a line across the page, horizontal line. Anything below it is the ego child's mind. Anything above it is a higher self. Now, you and I know there's no line. There's just this wonderful arena and continuum. But just for our purposes of understanding this, so draw that horizontal line, draw a vertical line through it, put at the bottom, bossy. Put at the top, what would come out of that? Someone who understands, someone who listens. Draw another vertical line, put at the bottom, dominant. Put at the top, good leadership. You see? Put at the bottom, another line. Weak, another line put at the top. Strong. Guys, you know, we vilify the ego child's mind. But it's up to every single person in the world to evolve past the ego child's mind and use the arena of the highest self. We are shamed and we vilify ourselves for having issues when it is the energy of those issues that gives us the ability to be something more in the highest self. You see? It's all part of life. We are supposed to grow and mature past these old selfish motivations and needing to dominate and that get our way, you know. There are people, adults, still working from the need to be right instead of the need to be kind. And I think the being kind is the most important thing you can do. Whatever that means. That doesn't mean being a doormat, by the way. That means treating everybody as fairly as you can possibly do in the moment. Realizing we're all God's children, right? Realizing that we have a responsibility to grow up and to care about people in our way. Guys, thank you so much for listening today. We'll be back next week. I won't be taking any time off. Ooh, Alexandra. Yes, good for you, Alexandra. That's wonderful. She said, I found that the things you overcome are the things you know most about and are able to share with others about it, so they can do the same. Alexandra, that is just such a lovely point. You know, I love, thank you, Lisa. I love teaching what I'm learning too, you know, and what I have learned. That's just wonderful. It's a way of owning it in yourself, and that's what life is about, isn't it? Owning it in yourself, whether you teach it or not. Guys, thank you so much for listening. I'm going to ask you, please, to continue to do what you're doing. Please get the word out about these shows. I believe on Blog Talk Radio, there is a comment thing, and you can post it to your social media account. And if you don't do that, if you will just get the word out about our shows every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, that would mean a lot. Oh, and I hope you all have a blessed week, too. You remember that God loves you through you, though. So it's about waking up and doing the right thing by yourself and others, right? Okay. So, guys, thank you so much for everything. Let's do a quick prayer, get us all clear and ready to enjoy the week and the day. Dear God, thank you so much for our being together. All of us, good friends, even though here we have not had lunch with each other or call each other on the phone all the time, and we still know each other and know each other's hearts. We thank you so much for all of this. We thank you for, thank you, Alexandra. We thank you so much for the opportunity to grow and change and evolve, to open our minds, to be a little different than we've ever thought of being before. We ask for healing now. We ask for the healing right now, that we may surrender anything in us that we can. We're surrendering it to the you that is us in the purest sense, our highest selves. We say we would like to be more loving people, so take these issues and fill us with love and the opportunity for growth and evolvement and change. Don't let us be afraid. It's all good. And we thank you, dear God, for it all. We say this prayer now in your name, in the name of the Ascended Masters, our love-centered guides and friends, and in the name of each and every person listening to the show. Thank you, dear God. And so it is. Amen. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next week, okay? Take care. Enjoyed being with you, by the way, and hearing from you. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.